From a 3-time world champion and the most dominant Pokemon in history, Snorlax has gone from one of the best Pokemon ever to an obscure, almost unusable one in Scarlet and Violet. In fact, its best finish at any of Scarlet and Violet's World Championships was 137th place, which, for context, is worse than Altaria and Slowking and barely better than Totodile. Which is crazy, but maybe he's just been too busy being successful in his new post-VGC life. Okay, maybe not. Then what caused Snorlax's historic downfall? I mean, it can't just be power creep since it last won Worlds in 2018, back when players could use both Mega Evolutions and Z moves. 2 generational mechanics that, despite Pulverizing Pancake being a hilarious name for an attack, Snorlax didn't even take advantage of. And the following generation buffed it with a special Gigantamax form. So, to fully understand what made Snorlax so great, as well as the things that led to its collapse, and even if there's any hope for a washed-up world champ with the release of Pokemon Champions, let's look back at Snorlax's complete competitive history, starting where it all began. Now, for the first decade, competitive Pokemon wasn't really supported by the Pokemon Company in any official capacity. So, outside of just a couple tournaments, which I'll get to in a bit, competitive Pokemon during the early years was basically just players coming up with their own unofficial rule sets where they'd attempt to balance the game themselves, creating a thriving competitive scene while the Pokemon Company just refused to. So no official circuit like we have today, no prizes, no money, and no fame. People played and fostered this unofficial competitive scene simply for their love of the game. But even without any kind of official format promoting sweaty yet creative play, the community quickly understood the sheer power of Snorlax. See, being a pure normal type, it had only a single weakness. But because of how uniquely good psychic types were in the first generation, fighting types and fighting type moves were practically non-existent. And with all these dominant psychic types generally being pretty physically frail, Snorlax matched up really well into them with its high attack stat backed up by a massive HP. But it wasn't only these unofficial fan-made rule sets where Snorlax dominated, because the first official World Championship was held in the year 2000. Games, though, were played on Pokemon Stadium using the Prime Cup rule set, which was very different from the unofficial rule set fans were playing with at the time. That's because Prime Cup first introduced what is now a core mechanic of modern competitive play, Team Preview, where players would see their opponent's team of 6 Pokemon before choosing the 3 they'd bring to the actual battle. Now, while Snorlax didn't ultimately win this first ever Worlds, it still had really good results, finishing on 3 of the top 4 teams. However, this first World Championship didn't include any players from Pokemon's birthplace, Japan, which takes us to the second generation of Pokemon, where Japan had a massive national championship with a really unique rule set that is still played a lot casually even to this day. The Nintendo Cup, which used Pokemon Stadium 2's Poke Cup, which, if you're not familiar, is similar to Pokemon Stadium 1's Prime Cup, but required a bit of algebra. You see, players would still reveal their 6 Pokemon before choosing the 3 they'd bring to battle. But unlike Prime Cup, which featured all level 100 Pokemon, Poke Cup allowed Pokemon at any level between 50 and 55, as long as the total level of your 3 Pokemon didn't exceed 155. This enabled an entirely new strategy in team building, one that we've never seen again in official tournaments. Because now you'd have to decide what level each of your Pokemon would be. Do you go for 2 level 50 Pokemon, all to enable a single much stronger level 55 Pokemon to carry you to victory? Or do you try and balance your team with a pair of level 52s and a level 51? And with how important speed is in Pokemon, being even just a single level higher could impact an entire battle, allowing you to outspeed and KO a Pokemon you otherwise may not have. But when it came to Snorlax, it was just as dominant here in Generation 2 as it was in Generation 1. In terms of stats, it was actually even better. See, in Red, Blue, and Yellow, Pokemon didn't have a special attack and special defense, like they have today. Instead, it was combined into just one stat called Special, and Snorlax's special stat in Gen 1 was pretty bad. But in Generation 2, while Snorlax's special attack remained mediocre, its special defense was increased massively. So it was no surprise that at this Nintendo Cup, it was on both finalist teams. And what I've got on both of my arms is a watch and some jewelry from Holzkern. In fact, for the last year and a half, I've been wearing my Holzkern watch as my daily driver almost everywhere I go. Which is why, for the second time on my channel now, I reached out and asked Holzkern if they were interested in sponsoring this video. Cause Holzkern's truly unique. They use natural minerals from woods like mahogany and oak to stones like marble and onyx. And in doing so, every watch turns out 100% unique. But it's not even just their watches. Cause Holzkern's collection of jewelry is equally as beautiful and unique. And with the season of giving upon us, Holzkern also makes for an amazing gift for your loved ones. This year, they graciously sent me this beautiful marble necklace, an elegant ring with meteorite and tungsten, and a subtle yet stylish bandlet. I personally really love how they can combine all of these unique woods and stones with different kinds of jewelry metals. Holzkern also provides free worldwide shipping from Vienna, and they handle all customs fees. Plus, with orders showing up in 3 to 5 days, any order placed by December 19th has a guaranteed delivery by Christmas Day. So, whether you want to treat yourself to something timeless and unique, or give a loved one a truly special gift, head to holzkern.com/RayRizzo and use code Rizzo for 15% off your purchase. That's holzkern.com/RayRizzo with code Rizzo for 15% off. Thanks to Holzkern for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the Nintendo Cup finalists. The runner-up though had his Snorlax and the rest of his team all at level 50, except a single Tauros set to level 55, which would be his main sweeper. Because Snorlax had such amazing stats, even at level 50, it was basically as strong as a level 60 Pokemon. But the winner took a more balanced approach. He filled his team with entirely level 51s and 52s, which would have a small advantage against all those level 50 Pokemon. And it didn't make it to the finals, but it was also pretty common for Snorlax to be played at level 55, where it would be the team's strongest sweeper with moves like Curse and Rest, so it was really flexible for this unique rule set. But while Snorlax dominated both of the first two generations of competitive play, it may actually have gotten even better in Generation 3, because two brand new mechanics were introduced in Ruby and Sapphire. The first is abilities, and Snorlax was fortunate enough to get a good one. The extra resistances it gave were so good that some people just gave up on Ice and Fire entirely. But the second new mechanic had the biggest impact on competitive Pokemon ever. Because after Generation 3, the Pokemon Company would finally start building an official competitive scene. And in the now almost 20 years of it, official competitive Pokemon would always be played using double battles. For Snorlax specifically, it didn't really matter. It was arguably the best non-legendary Pokemon period, regardless of whether that was singles or doubles. At Japan's National Championship in 2005, for example, a tournament where all the broken legendaries like Kyogre, Groudon, and Mewtwo were banned, Snorlax was on both finalist teams and absolutely dominated the format. And then at the 2006 US National Championship Journey Across America, or JAA for short, it would repeat that same feat, but this time in a rule set that allowed an unlimited number of those overpowered legendaries. Nowadays, we refer to them as restricted legendaries because, well, players are normally restricted in how many they can use. So the fact that Snorlax was as successful as it was, even in a rule set where you could stack a team filled with these guys, really says a lot to just how good a Pokemon it was. But it was all thanks to one move.
Keep going with that body slam. That must be the best move in the game.
No, it's not Body Slam. It's the move Self-Destruct. See, if you look up Self-Destruct in any of your old games, it looks like a pretty straightforward 200 base power move. But what the games don't tell you is that the move also halves your opponent's defense, effectively giving it a base power of 400. And that's before the same type attack bonus Snorlax gets. So forget about Water Spout Kyogre and Earthquake Groudon, it was Snorlax who was both insanely bulky and capable of one-hit KOing every Pokemon you have on the field at any moment. Which is why it's crazy that Snorlax was actually buffed in the very next generation with the release of Diamond and Pearl. And it was actually because of an old move from Gold and Silver that finally became a viable strategy. Because thanks to Snorlax's massive bulk, it could reliably trade half its HP in exchange for maxing out its attack stat. But it was Diamond and Pearl that made that a viable strategy, because Snorlax was now able to become one of the fastest Pokemon in the entire game, allowing it to actually sweep teams after a belly drum. I'm of course talking about the move Trick Room. This strategy was exactly how Snorlax won both the Japanese National Championship as well as its first of 3 World Championships, all in the first year of Diamond and Pearl. But self-destruct Snorlax was still just as good, if not even better now. The newly introduced Custep Berry made its self-destruct even more unpredictable, cause even at low HP, it could explode and knock out all your Pokemon out of nowhere. And this exact set won Snorlax his 2nd World Championship the very next year. But Generation 4 was actually the last time Snorlax would even be relevant for almost a decade, because Explosion and Self-Destruct were finally nerfed. They now actually reflected the base power listed on the moves themselves. No longer did they randomly halve the opponent's defense, meaning their power was effectively cut in half. After reaching at least the top 4 in every World Championship to this point, this one change single-handedly made Snorlax's usage self-destruct. Because in Generation 5 and Generation 6, Snorlax didn't have a single good tournament finish. Which brings us to Alola and the introduction of Z moves. But why was Snorlax finally good again this gen? I mean, compared to the last time it was good, 2 broken Intimidate Pokemon now existed, a different broken Pure Normal type now existed, and Snorlax, who was one of the lucky few to get a signature Z move, didn't even use it.
Where are the pancakes?
Well, Gordo, the reason there were no pulverizing pancakes is because this generation, Snorlax was a glutton for a different food item. Because a certain set of berries received a massive buff in Sun and Moon. These 5 berries were previously completely terrible. They healed a measly 12% of your HP, but only when your HP fell into the red. And only 12% of you guys are subscribed. So if you're enjoying the video and you like these retrospectives on some of VGC history's most influential Pokemon, go ahead and pulverize that subscribe button. We're getting close to 100k, so let's try and make it happen before the end of the year. Anyway, Citrus Berry by comparison healed 25% whenever your HP fell into the red or yellow. It doesn't take a math genius to see that Citrus was better in every way. But that all changed in Generation 7, cause those 5 berries now healed 50%, giving players a real strategic decision to make. Do you go for the increased healing that only activates at very low health? Or do you go for Citrus, which will more reliably activate but only heal a quarter of your HP? Well, for Snorlax, there was no decision, because thanks to its other ability, those 5 berries got the best of both worlds. They activated at 50% and healed 50%, and Snorlax was able to recycle these berries infinitely, literally, which really made it the ultimate setup sweeper. In 2017, where only Pokemon native to Alola could be used, Paul Ruiz took Belly Drum Snorlax to a 3rd place finish at Worlds, while Nils Dunlop took it to a 5th place finish. And at 2018 Worlds, it was again Paul and Nils taking Belly Drum Snorlax to its best finishes. Nils improved on his 5th place finish from the year before, this time finishing 3rd, and Paul, who bested his previous 3rd place finish, brought Snorlax its 3rd and final World Championship title, marking the last time Snorlax would be one of the game's best Pokemon. Because despite the very next generation giving Snorlax a special Gigantamax form in Sword and Shield, it more importantly changed how much healing those 5 berries gave. While this wasn't a direct nerf to Snorlax, as many Pokemon used these berries in the previous generation, even ones that didn't have the Gluttony ability, it still hurt Snorlax more than most. However, its new Gigantamax form did somewhat make up for it, because Snorlax's signature G-Max move was a huge buff for the Belly Drum sets. Basically, prior to Gigantamaxing, Snorlax could use Belly Drum and then heal a 1/3 of its HP with a berry that same turn. Then next turn, it could Gigantamax, which not only would double its HP, making it even tougher to KO, but that signature G-Max move would do a ton of damage. And it had a high chance to restore the berry it had just eaten, healing another 1/3 of its HP. And this set did have some success, but it never came too close to winning a major tournament. In fact, the closest it came to winning a major tournament was as an all-out attacker, a set we never really saw have success before, because future international champion Alex Gomez took a choice band Snorlax set to a 3rd place finish at a major regional championship. It was actually a bit of a callback to the old days, because this Snorlax had self-destruct, a move we hadn't seen used on it in almost a decade. But Choice Band made up for the reduced damage it now did, and since Alex paired it with 3 ghost types, it was always a threat to explode. And in the Dynamax era, when things had massive HP stats while dishing out insane amounts of damage, having a Pokemon with the bulk of Snorlax and the ability to actually do big damage was key. Unfortunately, just as Snorlax was putting up some decent results, the circuit had to be put on an indefinite hiatus. And once it finally returned, Snorlax's best was mostly behind him, as legendaries like Urshifu, Zacian, and Groudon were all unleashed into the game by the time the circuit resumed. But with the release of Scarlet and Violet, Snorlax hit a new low, which, to be honest, was a bit surprising. It seemed like the Terastallization generation would be really favorable for it. It was a lower power level mechanic, as it didn't give Pokemon a massive offensive boost and could even be used defensively as well, something that you would think would be pretty good for Belly Drum Snorlax. In fact, in the same DLC that brought Snorlax to Paldea, a brand new Pokemon was released that looked like it was handcrafted for Belly Drum Snorlax, Sinistcha, who, thanks to its ability, whenever it enters the battle, it heals its allied Pokemon's HP. And it even gets Trick Room and Rage Powder. It's hard to come up with a Pokemon who, on paper, would be a better partner for Snorlax. But even in the most favorable format possible, Regulation H, which banned all Legendary and Paradox Pokemon, Snorlax's best finish was 29th at a 400-player international championship. A great finish, but nothing like what Snorlax had achieved in previous generations. And this result was one of only 2 times Snorlax even finished in the top 32 the entirety of Scarlet and Violet. So where does this leave Snorlax for Pokemon Champions? With all these old mechanics returning to competitive Pokemon, will we also see a return to the times when Snorlax was good with them? Well, to be honest, I'm not so sure. The indirect nerfs Snorlax received, first to self-destruct, then to the HP those 5 berries healed, they were all pretty impactful, to the point that even though Snorlax dominated the Z-move era in Sun and Moon, I'm not that confident that adding Z-moves back into the game now in 2026 would help it. I mean, even aside from those indirect nerfs, Pokemon also released some actually really good fighting types since the Z-move days. Now, on the bright side,
What's the bright side?
assuming we won't be able to both Gigantamax Snorlax and Terastallize it at the exact same time, because that might be too broken if we can do that, I do think it'll at least be a solid pick in some rule sets based on what we saw from it much more recently in Sword and Shield. Especially if we combine Dynamax being available, but in a format that bans Legendaries and Paradox Pokemon, because that would give it the best of both Sword and Shield's mechanics and Scarlet and Violet's rule sets, something that's now possible with Pokemon Champions. Snorlax is my favorite Pokemon, but even so, I'm cautiously optimistic that he can return to at least being decent again after seeing what he's unfortunately become in Scarlet and Violet. And don't forget to head over to Holzkern with code Rizzo for truly unique watches or jewelry this holiday season.